Thank you to my patrons. Your generosity and commitment to my work is astonishing. I sincerely appreciate it.
Everyone has a common and confused knowledge of God's existence, but like any other form of knowledge, this common and confused knowledge of God is open to development for those who have the time, interest, and intellectual gifts for developing it.
How condescending is this argument? Everybody has an intuitive knowledge of God. It just needs to be developed.
Aquinas taught that human beings have a natural knowledge of God.
You're just confused.
This common and confused knowledge of God is open to development.
Can you imagine the reaction from the theistic community more generally? If one of those poster children, if you will, for atheism got up on a stage and said, well, everybody naturally recognizes the non-existence of God. It's just that some people are confused. Can you imagine how condescended to they would feel?
Tide goes in, tide goes out. Never a miscommunication. You can't explain that.
Evolution is a religion.
If there is just one chance in a million that this is true, it's worth believing.
Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here, and don't worry, the video is about to begin. I just wanted to take a moment to make you aware of my Patreon, the link for which can be found in the description below. Sign up today for as little as £3 per month and you can gain access to a plethora of perks and extras, including downloadable audio-only and ad-free versions of my podcast that you can listen to on the go. You can also have your question answered in a monthly video, and better still, depending on which tier you choose, you could even sit down for a Skype call with yours truly, Magic Skeptic. All that is available and much, much more. All you got to do is click the link in the description below. I hope to see you there. Hey everybody, Magic Skeptic here. And boy, have I got a good one for you today. Get your prayer beads ready. Get on your best suit. We're all going to church this Sunday to bow down to the Lord. Why? Because I've got no less than 5 proofs for you today for the existence of God. Oh, brother. These 5 alleged proofs are attributable to one Thomas Aquinas, a figurehead of the Christian church, a godfather of apologetics. And so we're going to dive right in here to Aquinas's 5 ways of allegedly knowing God's existence. Have a listen.
One of the greatest questions of all times is whether God exists. And Thomas takes the question head on with his famous 5 ways or 5 proofs for the existence of God. In this episode, we will give a brief sketch of the 5 ways. But let us first ask how human beings can know the existence of God. One way to know God's existence is by taking it on faith from what the Bible says.
Sounds like we're on a promising road of proving that God exists. Do continue.
But Thomas is well aware that the Bible itself tells us that there's another way to know the existence of God. In Romans chapter 1, verse 20, St. Paul tells us that the existence of God is known to everyone, at least in a general and confused sort of way, from the beauty and goodness of the natural world.
The beauty and goodness of the natural world. Look, I'm not going to deny that I can stare out into a sunset and feel a sense of emotion. I'm not going to deny that I feel feelings and that nature can contain within it great beauty and can instill within an individual a wonderful sense of awe. That's fantastic, but there's also the existence of the humble tapeworm that exists in your body and causes immense pain and is incredibly difficult to remove. There's also the existence of things like cancer and things like earthquakes and volcanoes and hurricanes. I don't know about you, dear listener, but the word beautiful is not the word that comes to mind when I think about children drowning in a tsunami. The word beautiful is not what comes to mind when I think about the excruciating and agonizing process that an individual has to endure in order to have a tapeworm removed. The word beautiful is not what comes to mind. So the beauty and goodness of the natural world, I can't help but feel like that to make this claim, one is forced to cherry pick. What do you think, dear listener? Let's move on.
And Romans chapter 1, verse 20 is a quick summary of a longer passage in the Book of Wisdom, chapter 13, verses 1 to 9. The two passages tell us to expect to find human beings who have never even read the Bible, but know that God exists just from their experience and rational reflection upon the natural world. Now, when Aquinas turned to the writings of ancient pagan philosophers, he found exactly that. He found people who had never read the Bible, but who had given serious arguments for the existence of God. The writings of ancient pagan philosophers confirmed the biblical teaching that it is possible for human beings to know the existence of God without ever even having read the Bible.
Please notice the casuistry that's at play here. Just because people in the past also believed in God doesn't mean that they knew that God existed. And just because people in the present believe in God doesn't mean that they know God exists. The word know here is being deployed inappropriately. Knowledge is something that I view as justified true belief. If something is elevated to the position of knowledge, it means that we have solid evidence, confirmatory evidence. When he says that people know that God exists,
but know that God exists,
he's elevating mere belief, mere faith, to the epistemic status of justified true belief. In other words, he's smuggling in the idea that there's strong and robust evidence for the existence of God, and yet he hasn't provided any. This is a form of sophistry. This is a form of casuistry. What he's doing is playing with the words here in order to elevate what is, in my estimation, mere faith, mere belief, mere assertion. He's attempting to elevate those things to the status of knowledge by invoking the word know. Suffice to say, the fact that people who predated Aquinas also believed in God does not constitute evidence that people can know that God exists without having read the Bible. All it confirms is that people who have not read the Bible could also potentially believe in a God or gods. And that brings me to the final point I want to make on this particular issue. He pretends in this video, the speaker I mean, like this is some kind of a revelation, like this is some kind of incredible prediction that the Bible makes, and that this serves as some kind of evidence for the strength of the Bible and the claims that it makes.
The writings of ancient pagan philosophers confirmed the biblical teaching that it is possible for human beings to know the existence of God without ever even having read the Bible.
But what a trivial prediction. Yeah, sure, the Bible says that people who haven't read the Bible probably believe in God as well. Oh my God, how shocking is that? This isn't an amazing prediction. It's not like the Bible got the lotto numbers correct here. The idea that people who haven't read the Bible also believe in God is the most trivial prediction ever. People all throughout history, all over the world, in different cultures, at different times, even today, believe in a God or gods. Religion appears to be ubiquitous among the human species. But this isn't, as he suggests in the video, evidence for people having a natural or intuitive knowledge of God.
St. Paul tells us that the existence of God is known to everyone, at least in a general and confused sort of way.
I think that's a symptom of something that is, in fact, ubiquitous and intuitive and natural for human beings, and that is irrationality. Human beings are irrational, and we believe all sorts of nonsense, regardless of the culture, regardless of the time. Human beings are predisposed to believing in nonsense. And I think that this phenomenon, this temptation, this natural urge we have to believe nonsense, is explained by our evolution. Human beings as a species are so desirous of answers that we'll even accept a bad answer in lieu of having no answer at all. So when the thunder and lightning frightens us in a pre-scientific age, we believe that Zeus is throwing his thunderbolts. When somebody falls to the ground and trembles with epilepsy at a time before medicine had developed, we conclude that there must be some kind of a possession, or that a demon has entered their body, or that a witch has cursed the individual. This is ubiquitous. This exists throughout all of human societies, throughout all human cultures, all throughout history. The reason many human beings believed in gods in the past has a hell of a lot more to do with our irrationality, and that's a much more likely explanation than the one that's being offered in this video.
St. Paul tells us that the existence of God is known to everyone, at least in a general and confused sort of way.
I.e., the reason so many people believe in a God is because God exists. That's ridiculous. And there are other potential explanations for the ubiquity of this particular belief as well. What about the fact that we are predisposed to assume agency? This is something that Richard Dawkins has explained quite well in evolutionary terms, and I think he's absolutely spot on. If you think about this in terms of survival, when we dwelt upon the savannas of Africa and you heard a rustling in the bushes behind you, was it better to assume A, that it's the wind, or B, that it's a lion? Needless to say, if you assume that it's A, the wind, and you're wrong, you get eaten. Whereas if you assume B and you're wrong, i.e. that it's a lion, the worst that happens to you is you get a little bit of a fright. But it's better to assume B every time you hear that rustling behind you, if indeed your goal is the survivability of yourself and your genes and your future kin. So you can see quite easily that there's a selection pressure against the human beings who assume A, that it's the wind. Those human beings would have been eaten and henceforth didn't pass on their genes. So look at what we've got here. A selection pressure acting on a human population over time that's going to produce human beings who have a natural propensity to assume agency, that the noise that they're hearing behind them, or in any location for that matter, is caused by an agent rather than something that lacks agency like the wind. Now take that and apply it to the rest of human experience. When somebody falls down injured and starts having an epileptic fit, what are we going to assume? We're going to assume agency, a demon, a devil, a witch. When the thunder and lightning that we fail to understand strikes at us and strikes fear into our hearts, what are we going to assume? We're going to assume agency. So you see, guys, there are very good evolutionary explanations for why human beings all throughout history assumed and believed in the existence of gods. There are very good evolutionary explanations. At no point is it necessary to invoke the existence of a literal God in order to explain the ubiquity of belief in a god or gods throughout history. And anybody who suggests otherwise is not a skeptic. There are far more compelling naturalistic explanations to do with human irrationality, our desire for answers, and our propensity to assume agency. All of these things are far more likely explanations. Suffice to say, Aquinas' observation that people who have never read the Bible also believe in God is an utterly irrelevant and trivial one, and it does not constitute evidence for the existence of any God, let alone the existence of the biblical God. But I guess if you're an apologist, you don't have much else to go on other than mere assertion, fallacies, and trivial observations that you hopelessly try to tie to your religion. But with that acknowledged, let's move on.
Aquinas taught that human beings have a natural knowledge of God, or to put it another way, that we can know the existence of God by using our natural reason or human intelligence. That is the kind of knowledge we're exploring here, our natural knowledge of God. Now, Thomas did not say that our natural knowledge of God was always explicit, clear, or easy to come by. He did not affirm that the existence of God was undeniable. Rather, he thought of the natural knowledge of God as falling on a spectrum of cognitive development. Everyone has a common and confused knowledge of God's existence, but like any other form of knowledge, this common and confused knowledge of God is open to development for those who have the time, interest, and intellectual gifts for developing it.
How condescending is this argument? Everybody has an intuitive knowledge of God. It just needs to be developed.
Aquinas taught that human beings have a natural knowledge of God.
You're just confused.
This common and confused knowledge of God is open to development.
Can you imagine if an atheist or one of the four horsemen of the apocalypse, if a Hitchens or a Sam Harris or a Richard Dawkins or one of those guys, can you imagine the reaction from the apologetics community? Can you imagine the reaction from the theistic community more generally? If one of those poster children, if you will, for atheism got up on a stage and said, well, everybody naturally recognizes the non-existence of God. It's just that some people are confused. Can you imagine how condescended to they would feel? This is one of those things that really irritates me, where there are a lot of people in the world who think that atheists are arrogant and that atheists claim to know things that they couldn't possibly know. when in reality all atheists are saying is, you know, all of these outlandish and ridiculous supernatural claims need some evidence before I'm going to accept them. Oh, how arrogant of me, you know? This idea that atheists are the arrogant ones when people like this guy in this video on this channel put stuff out like this, where they suggest that atheists are just confused, that we all have an intuitive knowledge of God, but we're just confused. We just need to develop it. We just need to use our reason, our God-given faculty of reason, and then we'll be able to see the truth. Well, let's have it, Aquinas. Let's have it. Let's hear your 5 ways of knowing. Lay it on me. I'm ready to be convinced. I won't hold my breath, however. I won't hold my breath.
So how exactly do we know the existence of God? The basic principle behind the 5 ways is that we know the existence of God from our experience of the world of nature and looking for an ultimate explanation of it.
And we're already in hot water. Tell me this, dear listener. Why would somebody look for an ultimate explanation? Can you see how we've already poisoned the well from the word go? This so-called natural theology is the absolute opposite to the scientific method. Some theists will entertain this utter delusion that natural theology is scientific in its methodology because it explores the natural world looking for evidence of the divine. But please notice that that's not what the scientific method does. The scientific method doesn't start with a conclusion and try to find evidence that fits. That's called confirmation bias. The scientific method starts with an observation of something happening in a particular way, and then we go about trying to explain why or how that thing is happening. Natural theology starts with its conclusion that God exists, and then natural theologians go out into the world looking for evidence to fit that conclusion, looking for, as he put it in the video, an ultimate explanation.
And looking for an ultimate explanation of it.
Well, I would submit to you, dear listener, that looking for an ultimate explanation for anything is already a poisoning of the well. Who said there had to be an ultimate explanation? Maybe a series of events is explained by explaining each individual event in the series. Maybe the whole series doesn't need an explanation. Maybe there doesn't have to be an ultimate explanation outside of the minutiae of things that have been explained within the series itself. This might sound like a strange point, but we're going to come back to this shortly when we get to Aquinas' ways of allegedly knowing that God exists. So keep that in mind, dear listener. But just before we dive in here, I wanted to make it clear that the well has already been truly poisoned by this exploration, this confirmation bias approach, where we're already looking for an ultimate explanation, i.e. a divine explanation. But anyway, let's hear what he has to say.
We use the same kind of reasoning that we use when we know the existence of any invisible cause from visible effects. For example, if I'm driving down the freeway and see a billowing cloud of smoke coming up from the horizon, I can infer there must be a fire, even if I do not see the fire, even if it's blocked from my view. The fire is invisible, but the smoke it produces is not, and I know the existence of the invisible cause from the visible effect.
But why is it that we have the ability to infer that the smoke is being caused by a fire? I'll tell you how we make that inference. It's because in the past, our experience has taught us that smoke comes from fires. Every single time you've seen a fire, you have seen it give off smoke. Each and every Halloween here in Ireland and in the UK, we light bonfires. And guess what? Those bonfires give off smoke. Those who are unfortunate enough to have endured a house fire know that that house fire gave off a hell of a lot of smoke. Our experience and all of the evidence of our eyes and our ears suggests that smoke is something that emerges from fires. That's why when you see the smoke in the distance, you can infer that there's a fire at its foundation. It's because the evidence suggests that that's the case. But look at where he's going with this. He's going to try and suggest that the existence of a universe allows us to infer an invisible cause, that being God. Well, I've got news for you. The fire is not an invisible cause. The fire is something that we have observed giving off smoke time and again in our own personal experience. Light a match. A lit match is a very small fire. What does it do? It gives off smoke. It's that simple. Anybody with an open fire in their home can tell you that fires give off smoke. So we have powerful inductive reason to assume that a fire is the best explanation for smoke that we see in the distance. It's not invisible, and he's about to equivocate on the use of this word. Fire is not an invisible cause of smoke. If indeed there's smoke in the distance and we can't see the fire with our own eyes, that doesn't make the fire an invisible cause of the smoke. It's just inaccessible at that point in time. The truth is, our past experience confirms that smoke is best explained by fires. That is something that isn't invisible. We have observed it time and again in the past. And so we have good inferential reason to assume that the smoke we're seeing now, albeit we can't see the fire, we have good reason to assume that that smoke is being caused by a fire. Equivocating on this to try and demonstrate that there's an invisible cause for the universe and that we call God is just ridiculous. God is actually invisible. God is described as spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, so you don't get to infer a God for the existence of the universe. God is a ridiculous inference because, unlike the fire, we have never observed a God. You cannot use this analogy. It's completely asshat backwards. It's an appalling analogy. The reason we can assume a fire as the cause for the smoke is because our past experience teaches us that that's the case. Show me the direct observational evidence of a God creating a universe. Show me the past experience that can verify that there is in fact a God that caused the universe. That is an improper inference. In short, you cannot infer a God as the cause of the universe because, unlike the fire example, we've never observed a God. And that is precisely why this analogy is so poor. But there's more. The other problem here is that we have a sample size of one universe. Please notice that with the fire example, we can rerun the experiment time and again. Every single time I light my open fire, I see smoke. Every single time I light a match, I see smoke. Every single time I've attended a bonfire, I see smoke. So we can rerun that experiment. Again, this gives us powerful inferential reason to assume that when we see the smoke in the distance, that the best explanation is a fire. Makes perfect sense. But we only have one universe. We can't rerun the experiment. We don't know how this universe formed. People will appeal to the Big Bang, but the Big Bang contains within it many mysteries in and of itself. The truth is, we don't even know what we don't know. We have a sample size of one universe, and we're stuck here eternally in the present, and scientists are trying to figure it out, and they figured out a hell of a lot, and that's wonderful. I'm a big fan of science, but the truth is there are still many mysteries about the universe, whether or not the past is eternal or whether or not it started at a finite point and so forth. These things, the jury is still out on them. We have one universe, and so we don't have enough data to make an inference about how universes come into existence. We can make inferences about where smoke comes from because we have an immense amount of data and past experience to go on. That's precisely why we can infer that the smoke in the distance is caused by a fire. But if you had never seen a fire, if fire was a mystery to you, you had never observed it, you didn't know what fire was, if you came into existence 10 seconds ago with your faculty of reason intact, but none of your experiences, and you saw smoke in the distance, you wouldn't be able to infer that a fire was at the root of that smoke because you wouldn't know what smoke is. You wouldn't know what causes smoke. You'd have no experience of smoke and where it comes from. And that's kind of the position we're in relation to the universe. We have no idea how the universe came to be, whether or not its past is eternal and so on. And just to those of you who might be screaming at the screen right now saying, we do know how the universe came to be. The Big Bang, the Big Bang, the Big Bang. Yeah, sure. We know that our local universe began as a consequence of the Big Bang. But beyond that, We have no idea because we can't get beyond the Planck time. Suffice to say, physicists will tell you that we are clueless. There's a hell of a lot we don't understand. So we're disbarred from making inferences. Inferences are based on probability, and you can't run probabilities when you have a sample size of 1. You just can't do it. So this whole analogy is appalling from start to finish. It simply does not work. And I hope that I've done some kind of a reasonable job at explaining that, dear listener. Let me know in the comments below. But for now, let's move on to his next analogy and see if that one is any better.
Or similarly, if I wake up one morning with a sore throat, I infer that I have some kind of infection or virus. I do not see the infection or the virus. The cause of the sore throat is invisible, but I know that it's there by reasoning from the experience of the symptoms. So it is with our knowledge of God.
And unsurprisingly, the second analogy is just as bad as the first. Yes, it's fair to infer that if you wake up in the morning with a sore throat and a temperature, that you have a virus. Fine. But do you know why? Because the evidence demonstrates that this is a reasonable inference. Speak to a virologist, look through their electron microscope, and you will be able to see with your very own eyes the virus that exists. These things have been confirmed. They are not invisible. Again, he's equivocating on the use of the word invisible. Viruses can be seen. Sure, they can't be seen with the naked eye, but with the advent of technology, we can see them. And what's more, we can see their effects. We also know that viruses develop over time. We know that they evolve. We know that people can create antiviral drugs. There's an immense amount of study and evidence that can demonstrate the existence of viruses. It's not invisible. So our inference that we have a virus when we become sick is a reasonable one. Again, he's using an inappropriate analogy. Yes, the virus is invisible to the naked eye, but I can see it through an electron microscope. I can study it. I can learn about it. I can study the evolution of viruses. It's not invisible in the same way. God is actually invisible. So distilling this argument down to its most basic form, here's what this video wants you to accept and believe, dear listener. Because human beings are willing to infer fire as the best explanation and cause for the smoke that we see in the distance, even though we cannot currently see the fire, that therefore it's reasonable to infer that an invisible, eternally elusive God is the best explanation and cause for the universe, despite the fact that nobody has ever observed such an entity. And using the virus analogy, because human beings are willing to infer that they have a virus when they have symptoms like temperature and a sore throat, even though we cannot directly observe a virus with the naked eye, that therefore it's reasonable to postulate and infer the existence of an invisible and eternally elusive Creator God as the best explanation and cause of the universe, even though nobody has ever observed such an entity. So you tell me, dear listener, is this a reasonable analogy? And are we guilty of being inconsistent in our application of epistemological standards? Are we unreasonable when we accept the existence of the fire that we cannot see, but then reject the existence of a God that we equally cannot see? Are we being inconsistent when we believe that we have a virus even though we can't see it with the naked eye, and then simultaneously reject the existence of God because we cannot see God with the naked eye? Because that's what the speaker wants you to accept. But I hope I've done something to dissuade you of this appalling analogy. Sure, while we cannot see the fire or the virus right now, the truth is we can. We can refer to our past experience, we can look through an electron microscope, and so forth. These things can be observed, and have been observed hundreds, thousands, and millions of times. That's what allows us to make the inferences we make when we feel the symptoms of the virus and when we see the smoke in the distance. The problem with God is that nobody has ever observed a God. Nobody has ever provided strong evidence of the existence of a God. So inferring that a God explains anything is just Madness. You might as well infer that magic is the cause of something. You might as well infer that a witch or some powerful sorceress is the cause of things that are happening. If we have never observed something, ever, if we have no evidence for something at all, surely that's a disqualifier for being a candidate explanation. It's that simple. And for that reason, I disqualify God. And I will continue to disqualify God as a potential explanation until such time that somebody provides evidence for the existence of such an entity. And crap analogies where God is compared to fire and viruses are not going to cut it. And so, with all that said, I'm moving on.
What we see or experience around us is the natural world. God is invisible. We don't see him. But from what we do see and experience of the natural world, we can infer that something must be behind it all. Something is responsible for the greatness, the beauty, the order of the world.
Just a quick point here, and it might seem philosophically masturbatory to point this out, but it is a relevant point, and so I'm going to make it. This idea that there must be something that explains the universe is actually a flawed one, and it would require a demonstration.
Something is responsible for the greatness, the beauty, the order of the world.
Leaving aside his claims of greatness, beauty, and order, all of which could be a video in their own right, he makes a claim here, an assertion, that something must explain reality, that something must explain the universe.
Something is responsible for the greatness, the beauty, the order of the world.
This seems like a pretty uncontroversial point of view, and in fact, you might be surprised, dear listener, to hear me resisting this point, but it must be resisted because I cannot just grant this premise. I cannot just grant this assertion. Isn't it possible that the universe merely exists as a brute fact? Isn't it possible that the past is infinite and that the universe has just always been? If that's the case, then the universe doesn't have an explanation. It merely is. And we cannot rule that out. Now, some of you might respond to this and say, but Magic Skeptic, that's ridiculous. Everything that we have ever observed has had an explanation and a cause. And true, I will agree with you. Our reality appears to be governed by the rule of cause and effect. Wherever we see an effect, it's preceded by a cause. Fine. But if the past is infinite, then the universe doesn't have a cause. It just always has been. Simple as that. Now, some people will say that an infinite past is impossible, that it must have a finite beginning, and that if dominoes are falling over, there has to have been a first domino that fell over and somebody must have pushed it. And I've heard all those arguments before, but if you listen to physicists on this topic, there's no consensus.
We have a thing called the Sloan Digital Sky Survey, which maps the positions of galaxies. So you know how much of the sky you've surveyed, and you know how many galaxies you counted, and then you can spread that across the wider universe. And you get this picture of a vast and possibly infinite universe. I mean, we know that the universe, or very strongly suspect that the universe is much bigger than the piece we can see. So we have good reason to think that's the case. Whether it's infinite or not is another question. And then that goes to your, can you picture infinity? Well, no one can picture infinity. There's a weird thing as well about, we say the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. So that's a measurement. So because we can measure the speed that all the galaxies are flying away from us, essentially. And then you can run time backwards, if you like, to find out when they were all on top of each other. And so it's quite a simple measurement, and we've done that. So we say the universe began 13.8 billion years ago. But actually, all we know really was the universe was very hot and very dense at that time. And we have some theories that the universe was in existence before that, and perhaps some sort of circumstantial evidence. And that means that actually the universe could have always been there, eternal.
The idea of an eternal past is still very much on the table. There are models of the universe that assume an eternal past, and there's nothing that is antithetical about that. There's nothing impossible about that. And what's really laughable is when theists say that an eternal past is impossible, and yet simultaneously and in the very same breath claim that there's an eternal God whose past is eternal. But then they say things like, but God is outside of time. The point I'm making is that God has always been, according to theists. There's no point at which God did not exist, which makes God eternal. So you don't get to appeal to the ridiculousness of infinity and eternality and then posit an infinite and eternal God and provide an exception for yourself. That's called special pleading. That's hogwash. And again, leaving theology aside because it's not really relevant here, when we look at the science on this subject, the jury is still out. The past might very well be infinite. Physicists are still working on this. Cosmologists are still working on this. We might well discover at some point that the past is in fact eternal. Fine. It could go that way. It might turn out that the past is finite. Fine. My position is I don't know, and the people who are working on it haven't established a consensus. They aren't sure. And so when this speaker suggests and posits that the universe must have an explanation, that's not necessarily the case. I'm sorry. Now, Aquinas couldn't have possibly known this because he was writing before the advent of things like the Big Bang and modern cosmology and physics, but I'm basing my view on the most readily available evidence, and the most readily available evidence suggests that the jury is still out. We cannot conclude, we cannot just suggest and assert right now that the past was definitely finite. That's not the case, I'm afraid. It might be, it might not be. The truth is, I don't know, and you don't know either. So when you assert that the majesty of the universe, the beauty and the order and all the rest of it cries out for an explanation, and that there must be something outside of it that explains it, you are just asserting things, and that has to be called out, which is exactly why I interjected on this point. And so with that acknowledged, let's move on.
Aquinas thought that this inference from the order of the world to the existence of something responsible for the order of the world was so fundamental that nearly all human beings reason this way. But he also realized that this inference, or argument, was something like a seed. The seed can develop and grow through study and the application of the mind to the many philosophical issues involved in making the inference. But the seed can also be crushed by attachment to sin, willful self-denial, false philosophies, and other adverse conditions that ruin it. So, we're not committed to saying that agnosticism and atheism are impossible. They might even become prevalent in some societies.
Translation, critical thinking, reasoning, and evidence is a real thorn in the side of theology. Agreed. We're agreed on something at least. Continue.
In the first way, we start with our experience of the order in the motion or change of things around us in nature. And careful study of what motion and change are leads us to conclude that there must be a first mover or unmoved mover or an ultimate source of change in things.
Please notice that the first way that Aquinas proposes is just one big fat assertion. He asserts that there must be an ultimate source of motion. Think of it like dominoes. If one domino falls over, it causes another domino to fall over, and another one to fall over, and so on and so forth. But there must be an original source of that motion. Now, I grant you easily that in our reality, that makes perfect sense. Dominoes don't fall over by themselves. There must be a cause. Maybe the wind blew over the first domino. Maybe a human pushed over the first domino. But there has to be a first mover, basically. That makes perfect sense within the bounds of our reality. But maybe that doesn't apply to the universe. Two thoughts occur on this. The first of which I've already addressed. The past might very well be infinite.
Actually, the universe could have always been there, eternal.
In which case, there's no first mover. There's no prime mover. There's no first anything. Using the domino analogy, it's dominoes falling over for infinity into the past. Now, I grant you that this isn't intuitive, but whoever said that the universe had to map onto our intuitions? If anything, the discoveries of modern physics and cosmology are remarkably counterintuitive. Just look at quantum mechanics and be prepared to endure the worst headache you've ever had. The universe is nuts. It doesn't map onto our intuitions. It's entirely possible that the past is infinite, in which case no first mover or prime mover is required at all. The second thing is equally counterintuitive. Maybe it is the case that the universe starts at a finite point in time, but it doesn't follow necessarily that therefore there's a prime mover or a first mover. It's possible that the universe came into existence out of nothing. Now, some of you are going to scream at me here and say that that's preposterous, that that's just as magical a thought as God did it. But just hold off for a moment, dear listener, and allow me to explain. If indeed there was a point before the universe came into existence where there was truly nothing, well then the rule of cause and effect wouldn't apply. You see, this entire first mover argument rests upon an intuition. The intuition is this: wherever we find an effect, it's preceded by a cause. Now again, I grant that that's true in our reality. Our reality appears to be universally governed by the rule of cause and effect. But if there was a state of nothingness before our reality began, well then that reality wouldn't include, or that nothingness wouldn't include, the rule of cause and effect. And if the rule of cause and effect doesn't apply in a state of nothingness, then wouldn't it be possible to have an effect without a cause? Isn't that conceivable? If indeed nothingness was the case, then the rule of cause and effect cannot possibly apply. No intuition we have could apply in a state of nothingness. And so that means it's possible, conceivably, that something could have come into existence out of that nothingness. Right? Is that so outlandish? Is that any more outlandish than the claim that God did it? A divine, immaterial, spaceless, and timeless being? Remember, if there was nothingness, the rule of cause and effect couldn't possibly apply. So, it's possible, at the very least, that the universe came into existence without the need for a prime mover or first mover at all, even if it started at a finite point in time, and we rule out altogether the possibility of an infinite past. Either way, we cannot grant Aquinas' first way here. The idea that motion guarantees an origin of all motion is hogwash. We don't require a first mover or a prime mover in order to explain motion. There are other explanations on the table. But again, the truth is, I don't know, and Thomas Aquinas didn't know either. And asserting things doesn't get us anywhere. So let's move on to his second way.
In the second way, we start with our experience of an order of cause and effect in things around us. When we reflect carefully on what causality is, we learn that in order for there to be causes at work, there must be a first cause, or uncaused cause.
I won't spend long on way 2 because it commits the exact same errors that way 1 commits. The first and most obvious error is that this is just one big fat assertion. The assertion that reality must have an ultimate cause is just that, an assertion, and as Christopher Hitchens put it, that which can be asserted without evidence can be dismissed as such. Now, some of you may point out that there is evidence bearing on this matter. You may say, hey, Magic Skeptic, every time we see an effect, it's preceded by a cause. That counts as evidence. Well, my response to you would be, why would you even dream of extending that rule of cause and effect beyond the boundaries of our universe? You have absolutely no reason to suppose that the rule of cause and effect goes beyond the walls of our universe. Maybe before the universe began, the rule of cause and effect didn't apply. Maybe the rule of cause and effect, as I pointed out in the answer to way 1, doesn't apply in a state of nothingness. If indeed there was nothingness before there was somethingness, well, who's to say that the rule of cause and effect applies there? What evidence could you possibly bring to bear on that question? All I'm saying is, I don't know, and anybody who suggests otherwise is committing a fallacy or making an assertion or just lying to you. You can decide which. The point is, you cannot infer that the rule of cause and effect applies beyond the boundaries of our reality. That's an improper inference. You cannot use the rules of our reality to say anything about what resides beyond our reality. So at best, Aquinas' assertion here is merely a candidate explanation among many. It certainly doesn't constitute knowledge. The real truth is, Aquinas doesn't know. I don't know, and the speaker in this video doesn't know. But isn't it curious? It's the scientists and the atheists who honestly acknowledge what they do and do not know. Leave it to the theist to tell you that they know how the universe began, and that they have a personal relationship with the creator who put all of this in motion, and who caused everything in the first place. It's just absolutely ridiculous. But with that acknowledged, let's move on to way 3.
In the third way, we start by considering the order of contingent beings, things that exist but do not have to exist. When we reflect on things that exist but do not have to exist, we naturally ask, why do they exist? This leads to the conclusion that there must be a source of the very existence of contingent beings, and the source cannot not exist. The source simply is.
Another big fat assertion in way 3 here. I feel it's important to point out that all 3 of the first 3 ways commit the fallacy of composition. This is the fallacy of assuming that the whole has the same characteristics and properties of the parts of the whole. Allow me to explain. The assumption is that because the parts of the universe follow certain laws and rules, that therefore the universe itself must also follow those laws. But just because all of the constituent parts of the universe follow the rule of cause and effect, it does not follow that the universe itself abides by the rule of cause and effect. The whole does not necessarily have the same characteristics and qualities as the parts of the whole. And if you don't believe that, let me give you a couple of examples. Just because all of the bricks in the wall are small, it doesn't necessarily follow that the wall is small. It could be a small wall, but it could also be a very large wall built with many small bricks. Let me give you another example. Just because cement, powder, and water are soft does not mean that those parts, when put together, will form a whole that is soft. We know that when you put cement, powder, and water together, what you form is concrete. So despite the fact that the parts of the whole were soft, the resulting whole did not have that same characteristic or quality. Now, some of you may point out that it can happen where the parts of the whole have the same characteristics and qualities as the whole itself, and I would agree. If all the bricks in the wall are red, the resulting wall will be red. Fair enough. The point here is that using the parts of the whole to diagnose something about the whole is inconsistent. It doesn't necessarily follow that the whole will have the same characteristics as the parts of the whole. And therein lies the problem. It is inappropriate and absolutely ridiculous to use the nature of our day-to-day experience to form conclusions about the nature of the universe as a whole. Sure, things in motion in our day-to-day experience have something that put them in motion. Fine, but it doesn't necessarily follow that therefore the universe has something that put it in motion. And if you suggest otherwise, you are committing the fallacy of composition. Sure, things in the universe abide by the rule of cause and effect, but it doesn't necessarily follow as a result that the universe abides by the rule of cause and effect. And if you say that it must, you are committing the fallacy of composition. Sure, the universe appears to be filled entirely with contingent objects that rely on something else for their existence, but it doesn't necessarily follow that therefore the universe is contingent and relies on something else for existence. And if you suggest otherwise, you guessed it, you are committing the fallacy of composition. So with that fallacy addressed, we're going to move on to way 4. Have a listen.
In the fourth way, we look at how things around us exist in grades of perfection, and the grades of perfection lead to the conclusion that there must be a perfect being, the source of being in everything else.
I think this might be the weakest of the 5 ways, but like usual, dear listener, I'll allow you to be the judge. All I'll say is this: the fact that things exist on a spectrum is irrelevant. First of all, the spectrum itself is a feature of our psychology. So there are better and worse chairs. But the better and worse there is a matter of subjective judgment. The chair that I think is better might be different from the chair that you think is better. The chair that I think is the most comfortable might be different from the chair that you think is the most comfortable. For example, I love recliner chairs, whereas I have some elderly relatives who hate them because when they lie down in a recliner chair, it hurts their back and they find it difficult to get out of such a chair. So the spectrum is a matter of subjective opinion, and that doesn't get us any closer to a God. Even if there was an objective standard for measuring the quality of chairs, it would still be a non sequitur to say that therefore there exists a perfect chair because we've identified an objective spectrum. The existence of a spectrum does not point to a zenith. The existence of a spectrum does not mean that there is a perfect example of that thing in existence somewhere. He's suggesting that because there are different states of existence, that some people live longer than others and different animals exist for different lengths of time compared to humans, that there must exist a spectrum of existence, and at the top of this spectrum would be the thing that exists perfectly or exists eternally. But this is just absolutely ridiculous. This doesn't even constitute reasoning. It's just pure assertion.
There must be a perfect being.
So anyway, I'm not going to say anything else about this point because it's just absolutely ludicrous. Let's move on to way 5.
And finally, in the 5th way, we find in nature that things without intelligence act for the sake of ends. Honeybees work to produce honey even though they do not have intelligence, properly speaking. Things without intelligence cannot work for the sake of an end unless a higher intelligence is directing them. This leads us to conclude that there must be a supreme mind or intelligence behind it all.
And we conclude, of course, with way 5, which is probably the most out-of-date talking point, and I don't hear theists using it anymore. In fact, I was surprised to hear it defended in this video. I thought perhaps the speaker might have the intellectual integrity to point out that this way has been more or less totally debunked. I certainly don't hear theists using way 5 in official debates anymore. Because, yeah, Charles Darwin debunked way 5 completely. Now, in fairness to Thomas Aquinas, we can extend an olive branch to him and say that he was writing hundreds of years before Darwin published The Origin of the Species. But evolution firmly and totally puts this point to bed. For Thomas Aquinas, writing at the time he was writing, it would very well have been perplexing when trying to understand how a bumblebee knows to do what it does, or how a beaver knows to build a dam, or how a bird knows to build a nest. It isn't obvious that these creatures are intelligent in the way that human beings are, so it seems reasonable to suppose that there must be some kind of guiding agent that directs these animals to enact their peculiarities, whether it be building a nest or producing honey or what have you. But unfortunately, evolution puts all of this to bed. We know that random mutations occur in DNA. Most of those random mutations are useless, but every now and then, a random mutation has utility. Maybe it's the random mutation that allows a flower to bend or tilt in the direction of the sun. Maybe it's the random mutation that allows a bird to build a nest or build a slightly better nest. Maybe it's the random mutation that gives the bird a better wing capacity so it can fly better, or what have you. The point is, random mutations provide things that help animals to survive. And over time, those random mutations that are beneficial are naturally selected for, which is to say, the animals that have advantages are better at procreating. They are more likely to send their genes into the next generation because of their advantage survival. And so over vast quantities of time, we end up with many different species with different advantages and abilities that, to us in the present, can seem quite perplexing if you weren't aware of Darwin's theory, right? So if you're looking at all of this as a human being writing hundreds of years ago, pre-Darwin, well then you're going to be perplexed by this. And when we see things happening that look complicated, it is natural, as I've pointed out earlier in the video, to assume agency. And the agency that Thomas Aquinas assumed was godly. That makes perfect sense. But theists don't have the same excuse that Aquinas had when he was writing. We know better now. The theory of evolution, acted upon by natural selection, is a far better explanation. It's got mountains of evidence to support it. We know why bumblebees do what they do now. We know how those mechanisms developed over time. And so that's the end of it. You don't get to assert that a divine agent is responsible for bumblebee behavior anymore. And if you do, you're a moron. Not my most sophisticated conclusion, but it'll do. Speaking of which, if you enjoyed the video, drop a like on it. That helps out the channel enormously and it costs you nothing. Other than that, if you'd like to support the channel at a more deeper level, if you want to become a supporter, a financial backer of the channel, you can jump into the description box below, click the link to my Patreon, and you can sign up there for as little as £3 per month. And depending on what tier you choose, you will gain access to a plethora of perks, bonuses, and extras. And in closing, thank you very much for watching this video, and I hope to see you in the next one. All the best. Bye-bye.